I think almost 30 when I had it. I was took it for longer. I managed to gain it back though. Over about 8 months. I wish I didn't. But...
Hey everybody, we need to get started here. We're running late. All right. Sorry, we're running a little late, but let's go ahead and get started. It's the August 22nd Grants Pass City Council workshop. And we're going to start off with a discussion on some of our local homeless shelters, an overview of what's going on, and then we can talk about what we might want to do in the future. And Brad, are you going to introduce or?
Hi, Mayor, Councilors. Hi. I'm Lisa Michaelis. I'm the Road Retreat Operations Manager for Josephine County. Currently at the Grants Pass Shelter, we have 2 elderly women. One is now on oxygen, and one elderly man who we've been told could die any day. We have another man who is approaching that age and living with cancer and several other serious health conditions. We have a middle-aged woman who has difficult to manage medical conditions and is using a walker to get around. We have 12 people in total staying there right now. And we also have 3 young men who are in active addiction and one dad with 2 of the cutest little toddlers. We have 157 people on the wait list who have not yet had a background check performed. 73 others didn't qualify for a variety of reasons. We've had 54 people served by the Grants Pass Shelter, 42 have exited. We have served 3 non-English speaking guests since March, so it's been really fortunate that we have a Spanish speaker on staff. At Foundry Village, we have 12 guests currently also. In addition to 3 elderly men and 2 older gentlemen who are either receiving or applying for disability, we have a woman who is currently applying for disability. She had been working full-time when she came into the village, but is no longer able to for medical reasons. We also have 1 employed teenage female, 3 employed young men, and a young couple where the female is working and the man is starting his job search this week. All employed individuals are working full-time. We've served 31 individuals who've moved on from the village. 1 passed away of natural causes in January. We've had several who have graduated successfully to their own housing. The most recent couple to leave found an apartment and were reunited with their children. The gentleman started a business while they were staying with us, and they have remained active in the recovery community. We've also transferred some individuals to Grants Pass Shelter where they've done better with greater oversight. A few have self-exited, and then some we have had to exit for non-compliance. I'm currently talking with key community members who may be able to help teach some life skills classes at the village. Some of the classes we're discussing are budgeting and personal finance, cooking meals on a budget or how to utilize food bank, food pantry items, resume building and interview role play, conflict resolution, communication, time management, healthy boundaries and healthy relationships, and basic auto maintenance. 4 of the unemployed villagers have regular volunteer opportunities at the village where they take responsibility for monitoring the household chores, restocking supplies, and overseeing the neighborhood cleanup project. This helps them feel productive and important and gives them some basic job skills should they be able to seek a part-time job. All of our guests at Foundry Village are required to participate in chores at the village, keeping their temporary home clean and kept up. And they're also required to meet with the case manager for 1 hour per week and accomplish 3 goals per week. Because the Grants Pass shelter was slated to be only a temporary facility, case management was not required. However, it was offered to interested individuals, and almost everyone has accepted that and taken advantage of that opportunity. We've welcomed community partners at both facilities, where our valued partners from WorkSource, Aquis, All Care, Options, Gospel Rescue Mission, and On Track have shared with our participants what they have to offer and how they might be able to help our participants move forward. I appreciate you allowing me this opportunity, and I would love to invite all of you to a tour to either facility or both facilities.
Thank you, Lisa. Council, do you have questions? Valerie?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for being here, and it is wonderful to hear of the success and what's going on. I think what I'm trying to figure out is, I've heard stories, we've all heard stories. We don't know what's going on with, Road Retreat. We understand they're under a lot of, situations. I've heard the shelter is only going to operate until such and such a day, and they're having to close doors. It's great to get an update at Foundry Village, but I guess my point in trying to get you here is to say, where are we in terms of, funding moving forward with what we have in our community? What is operating now? What will continue to operate? What are the sources that we have to support those? And I think part of it was, we were hoping to have UCAN here, which I don't know if we ever heard from UCAN, never heard from UCAN, because we do know we have stored things and, just kind of, since everything's in such flux, to trying to figure out where are we at this moment? What do we have? What is going away? What needs to happen in our community?
And I apologize, but a lot of those questions I simply can't answer because I don't know the answers to those. Sam Engel of All Care and I worked on a grant application with 2 individuals from the city. We right now have funds to keep going through the end of September. So I've been given a potential closure date of September 23rd. If those gap funds can't be secured, I know Sam's also working on some other possibilities for continued funding.
Okay, so I think my question goes back to the shelter has been funded up to this point through All Care. Is that what we're saying? I really don't know.
It's been UCAN mainly.
It has been UCAN. So the shelter has been at this point funded through UCAN, and that will continue till September 23rd.
Correct.
Correct. And Foundry Village funding has come through?
All Care is our largest funder there.
Okay. And at that point, it's kind of still in flux based upon the grant that was put forth? Is that what you're saying?
As far as Grants Pass Shelter, yes, Grants Pass Shelter is up in the air.
Okay. And how about Foundry Village?
Foundry Village is solid.
Solid, okay. And that funding currently comes through
All Care primarily.
Okay. Okay. I'll leave that to somebody else to ask questions.
Other questions? Joel?
So then the economic difficulties, and I know it's difficult when you look at the state study for economic viability of operating expenses, especially for emergency shelters. It's tough all across the state. With the recent difficulty that your organization has had, which is not unique, it's happened a lot, and there was some loss of funding and then a subsequent loss of employees. And that has to translate to some organizational impacts. So my question is, they were rather significant. Is that all associated with the operations down in Medford where they're closing things
Yes.
and they're letting those employees go?
Yes, it has all been Medford at this point. We're kind of in a little bubble over here in Grants Pass, and so
Okay.
we have not been affected by those changes.
Okay. And then the other thing is there any and you may not want to answer this, or you may not have privy to it, but it's important in terms of the city. Is there any legal action associated that's yet to come, associated with either participants in shelters or employees that have been let go, that could affect your operations here in Grants Pass?
Not that I'm aware of.
No, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Brian?
Hi, Lisa.
Hey.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks for the tour at the shelter last week. It was,
welcome.
it was really good to see it, in person. The question I had about the numbers there was, you said you had 157 people on the wait list, and I don't think you're running at capacity right now, so I'm just wondering why there's such a long wait list when you're not at capacity.
We had a bout of COVID go through and wipe out our staff. We had one swing shift member who had worked 12 days straight. Our staffing was just decimated for weeks. And so I felt that we could not provide adequate care, appropriate care to 27 people. So we were trying to keep it at about half until we could get back up on our feet again, health-wise.
Okay, thank you for that. And then regarding that number, 157, I don't want to assume, but it sounds like you may be running out of funding here in about a month. So are you in a position where you're potentially not bringing new people in until you have that funding secured, or are you actively trying to bring people in, or?
I'm actively trying to bring people in, even if it's for one night and they have the opportunity to get one good night's sleep and a shower and a meal in their belly, meet with the case manager one time. I think that that's worth it. So
Okay.
I'll keep going until the day we close the door.
Okay, that's great. And then that 157 people, what is the shelter's capacity to move through that quantity? I'm just wondering, that sounds like a lot.
It
So I
does.
don't know if that's like 3 months, 6 months, a year, or
It really is going to depend on who comes in. We've got so many medically fragile people who are not going to move very quickly through the program.
okay, thank you.
Rob?
Yeah, you had mentioned there's a lot of applicants that that you turned down for, I guess, failure to pass a background test.
Yeah.
Could you describe some of or typical reasons people don't make the grade?
So all we're looking for are sexual predators and pedophiles. That is the only thing as far as a background check that will get somebody denied. But oftentimes what I'm running into, by the time I get that background check run, we have a bed available and staff that's adequate. They have found other housing, they are currently incarcerated, or their phone is no longer in service.
Joel?
I appreciate you coming to our consensus workshop.
Oh, thank you so much. I love
And that
that.
was very enjoyable, and
It was.
your contribution was appreciated, I think, by everybody at the workshop.
Thank you.
One of the themes of the workshop was compassion and accountability. And you've kind of addressed it on the periphery, but in your existing structure that you have, it seems to me you provide both compassion and accountability. Could you elaborate on that?
So we meet people where they're at, and for some people that may mean they are active in addiction, dealing with some pretty severe medical concerns, mental illness. So we meet them where they're at, bring them in, try to provide them and connect them with services that are appropriate. As far as accountability, we do expect at Foundry Village, and they sign a community agreement. Everyone's well aware of what's expected of them when they come in, that they will participate in the community by doing chores and maintaining the premises. They will meet with the case manager once a week, and they will perform 3 goals that they determine with the case manager. We ask that no one use on-site. If they come back to the facilities and they're high or intoxicated, we ask that they go back to their room and not be disruptive to the rest of the community. We don't allow violence or weapons on either facility site.
Then also, is there some screening before you accept them, either a recommendation by the police or whatever?
Oftentimes, I do utilize the police department for both facilities. As far as Foundry Village, they fill out a 4-page application, and then I perform an interview with them and ask them several questions, almost like a job interview.
Thank you.
Other questions? Val?
Yeah, you talked about the medically challenged, that obviously often these people come, and then once they have a space, it's just like you recognize all the medical issues that they have. Are there more funding sources available that you're able to bring in when that happens, or how does that work?
So I'm not involved in the funding process in the grant applications and all of that, so I cannot speak to that. I do know that we work very closely with all CARES coordinators. Their care coordinators have been golden to us as far as helping those individuals.
I just realize and know just from my own cases how much there is a lot of medical help available once they get established and are recognized as having that. So it's good to know that you can pull in those resources as well.
Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah. So as you know, we've been trying to work at the city on establishing some sort of entry-level site, whether you call it an urban campground or a resource center or what have you. And we've had roadblocks along the way, and we've kind of hit another roadblock right now. So we're not totally sure where we're going at this point with that. So I don't know if you have any advice or input or opinion on suggestions of where we might go.
I personally would just really love to see the shelter continue. I have followed a lot of the controversy in the community and have seen so much of the backlash. As we talked, people don't like that word campground. I know one individual told me that they think that sheltering folks is a better way. It provides more honor to them as individuals to have them inside of the shelter rather than camping in a tent, even if it is in a structured environment. So I think that we've got the shelter. We've got some trained staff, that it would be really wise to keep going with that. I also watched on Facebook and noticed that the Allen Creek Neighborhood Group doesn't even know we're there. Some people were saying, oh no, they lost funding and it's not there. So we're not disruptive to that community, and I think that that's good to just keep going with where we're headed.
Does the shelter have, do you feel like the shelter has the capacity to handle enough people this winter to keep the homeless population safe in Grants Pass?
It would make a dent. It would make a dent.
Okay, thanks.
I think more beds and more space is always better. Yeah, we've got a huge homeless population. But a lot of those people aren't going to come in, too. I went down to Grants Pass, to Riverside Park and to Morrison Park when it was snowing with 2 of our police officers and individuals from UCAN and Options, just thinking that if I introduced myself, hey, I'm not scary, that folks would want to come in, and people didn't. So we will hear the no's from some homeless people.
Sure. The other piece is that at the city yard, we have 20 emergency shelters, pallet shelters that are, I think you're familiar with what those are, and they've been sitting there for 1 winter unused already, and I would hate to see them go unused again. So if you have any ideas of how your organization or the city might be able to utilize those this winter, that would be great. Thanks.
I think if we could find property close to the shelter, or so that everything could work in conjunction as more of almost like a navigation center, that would be the best utilization of resources as far as staffing.
Okay, thanks.
Joel?
So this is secondhand through the newspaper, and I don't know what the reality is. I do know when we got the contract with All Care, and we were looking at a property, they backed out of it saying they didn't have the organizational capacity to follow through with it in a manner that has integrity. As I look at our homeless mitigation plan that came out of our homeless workshop, That type of facility with accountability and compassion can be a very positive thing. If we have the organizational capacity to run it in an appropriate way, along with care management and appropriately staffed and funded and all those kind of things. Then the other thing that I heard was that it's not a priority right now with Rogue Retreat to focus on that. They're trying to focus on keeping what they have open and going. Can you comment on that in terms of the priorities for your organization?
I can't comment on that. I'm sorry, a lot of those conversations are behind closed doors in Medford, and I'm just not privy to that. I think we have a lot of great community members, community partners here in Grants Pass, and I fully believe in our community to build some sort of a coalition and keep moving forward with what's best for Grants Pass. As you said, things like this aren't uncommon with nonprofit organizations. They happen. I'd like to see Grants Pass keep moving in a positive direction regardless of what happens with Rogue Retreat.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Check, we have a couple of people online, but I'm not seeing that they have their hands raised. So, okay. Are you going to stick around for a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have somebody else speaking.
Thank
and
you.
we can follow up with questions later. Looks like Leah's up next.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm Leah Swanson. I think most of you probably recognize me at this point. I'm the Josephine County Public Health Emergency Preparedness Coordinator. We are going to talk about cooling and warming shelters. I'm here with Kristen Smith from the Food Bank, who's been an amazing partner. I do just want to start with my support for what Lisa's done. I've been to both of those sites, and they are pretty outstanding. They're doing great work for the community. But they are not providing emergency type sheltering. And so we finally have had several cool shelters up and running this summer. And I'm going to let Kristen really talk more about the specifics of it because the food bank has been the one kind of heading that up. So I'll pass it over.
So I'm the farm manager with the food bank, so cooling shelters aren't necessarily what I do. But with the food bank, we rely on volunteers for everything, and the same with the cooling shelter. The Unitarian Universalist Church has opened their doors and have given 13 volunteers to keep it open. It seems like right now we're doing 95 degrees and above. So we've been open for 12 days with the help with, I'm going to call them the UUs because it's so much easier to say, and our own food bank volunteers. We've served 104 guests during those 12 days. And we've been open we're kind of changing the times, and right now we're going from 2 to 6. Earlier in the summer, it was from 4 to 8, and that was just due to volunteer capacity. And 6 o'clock, ending at 6, seems like a good time right now because it's getting a little bit cooler. So altogether, we have 24 volunteers from our community that are just willing to show up and keep a place open, and we provide food and drinks, and it's been really lovely, and people have really appreciated a place to take a nap and to get a break from the heat.
Any questions for Kristen? Joel?
Well, I just appreciate what you're doing. That's not a question. But it's an important part of our community, and I know the numbers aren't real big, but for anybody that needs the service, it's good to have it there. And I also appreciate the volunteers, and I'd encourage anyone else that wanted to volunteer get involved. One of the things that I've noticed throughout my career, and I've been a government employee for 35 years, when the government gets involved in stuff like that, price goes up crazy. All you got to do is look at the price of medicine or the price of education, or even our own experience with us trying to put a warming shelter together where it was costing $700 per person per night. And it was more of a political statement than it was a sustainable operation. What you're doing is a very sustainable operation. And there's no questions here. I just want to say thank you.
Val?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that and ask the question. So the church, what is the capacity? I mean, how do they have like a large room? Do they have cots? How does that part of it work? Or is it just like a resting area?
The church is probably about the same size of this area, so it's pretty small. I would say 20 people would be at capacity for comfort. You could probably go higher. And then we do have some cots that public health was able to give us.
Okay.
And probably could seat, I don't know how many seats there are. About 20, yeah.
Okay, so, and just in terms of volunteering, would people who did want to volunteer or whatever go to the food bank, the Universal Church? How do they actually make that contact?
Yeah, so they can call the food bank. I'm kind of organizing the volunteers. The UUs organize their facilitators, so we always make sure that one volunteer is from the Unitarian Church, and then we have one extra volunteer from the food bank, and they can go on our website or give us a call, and we'll hook them up.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, couple more. Vanessa.
Thank you, ladies, for all of the work that you're doing here. You seem to be doing everything so wonderfully on your own, but is there anything that the city can do to support you?
I think that getting the word out is really challenging. How do we tell people that we're open, especially when it's maybe just 2 times during a week? And so I would love to have people think about ways to communicate to our unhoused population and for people that just don't have air conditioning, that there's a place to go to.
Okay, great.
Brian.
Thanks, Kristen, for everything that you're doing there. My question is more around winter and the UU's ability or potential to run a warming shelter in the winter time. Has there been any discussion about that yet?
There hasn't been, and I think that would be a whole nother challenge to stay open at night. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Rick.
So you mentioned getting the word out so that more people are aware of your facility. What has been the occupancy, 50% or 25% of people showing up, or have you?
Yeah, so we have people that come in and out throughout the day. So they might come in just for 15 minutes, or they might stay the whole time. So it could be from anywhere from 5 to 25%. So there's a lot more room for people to come.
Okay, thank you.
Joel.
So as we put our homeless mitigation plan together, just recognize that your organization and your efforts are one important part of that. So I just wanted to thank you again.
Thank you.
I thought of another thing we could request the city if you guys had interest. One of our nurses that does regular services through the parks around town mentioned that people said they'd like to come, but they don't have gasoline for their cars, or they don't have a car, or whatever. Transportation to the site is difficult. So I'd been working with transit and Ready Ride, but everything has its ups and downs, and we just really don't have a great way. I'd love it, ideally, the days we were open, we would drive a car through the park at 4. Everybody would know you can get a ride there at 4. And then at the end of the shelter, when it closes, we drive a car back through the parks and drop people off. So transportation would be great. I think the city of Medford does something similar.
I think what efforts are being done right now to let people know? I know it was in the newspaper, and I volunteered on Friday, and several people said they'd heard about it from the newspaper.
Yeah, social media, I try to send it out to a wide group of people to share among their networks. Those nurses that I have that do canvassing through the parks go out and hand out flyers. I think a lot of it's word of mouth. Anything else you can think of? It's very, there's nothing formal. It's very informal communication at this time.
Yeah, it's kind of tricky because it needs to be done so last minute, depending on the weather. So getting word directly to the people in specific locations is probably the best way.
Right. And for those that we're serving that are houseless, they often don't have cell phones regularly, access to internet. They don't get a newspaper delivered to their home. So that specific population is a little extra challenging.
Right, and so do you have people, I mean, is there any capacity to get the word out to people, or?
Yeah, the nurses that canvass the park get the flyers out. We were able to get some bus tokens, and so that was exciting to be able to go out and both advertise the shelter and transportation to the shelter this week. But it is very much like we have to go into the parks to make sure that we can let people know.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I mean, I heard earlier that, you know, that government help isn't needed and that it's a sustainable program, but it's also when you're relying on volunteers, you know, it's one thing to staff the actual shelter with a couple people, but then you definitely need a lot of kind of boots on the ground getting the word out to people.
Yeah,
So.
and we live in a great community, like the Joco Equity Project, I think does a lot of promotion of, you know, news for that population, but certainly, yeah, we could definitely use more boots on the ground communication about it.
And then I know we kind of started asking questions before you were done talking, but as far as an overnight shelter, what are some of the differences? Because obviously this is just happening for a few hours in the middle of the afternoon, but an overnight shelter is a real different situation.
Yeah, certainly staffing an overnight shelter is much challenging. Getting somebody to stay all night, stay awake, being able, you know, to provide services throughout the night. Also, meals are a little bit more complicated. You know, we might open the doors like at 5, for example. It starts to get really cold about that time, and so people are hungry for dinner or breakfast. Creating enough space where people can sleep. I mean, you guys created a lovely shelter New Year's Eve last year and realized that that was a whole different bear, sort of. People need much more space. You know, if they have pets, which we're allowing in our warming or cooling shelter now, that is a whole nother need as well. Those are just the things I can think of off the top of my head, but there are many more challenges.
Other questions? Okay. Did you have more that you were going to say?
No.
Okay.
Thank you for having us and for having these discussions. It's very important.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Did we have anyone else to present or council discussion? All right. So I guess the idea today was just to give you a bit of background on what's already happening around town and follow up, you know, our plans for the campground property had temporarily stalled out anyway. So we need to be thinking about what we're going to do from here and whether the city's going to have any role in this going forward. Thoughts? Val?
Well, I still would like to find out, which is what I think a big part of it is try to get contact with UCAN, because UCAN over the last several years has been a funding source. You know, I'm not sure exactly where that funding comes from. I'm assuming it comes from the state. I know that UCAN is putting together a navigation center because they were given a grant in Douglas County. So I know they probably are still functioning up in Douglas County. So I would just, you know, that to me, you know, he said we have the $1 million, and yes, there's a stop right now figuring out as things kind of pencil out, but I really would like to have some numbers to kind of give, you know, figure out as we move forward what is the best use of that money to keep something moving through this coming winter. So I guess that is my, I mean, it's wonderful to hear, and I wish the community could hear of the success stories and what is happening at Foundry, and that, you know, with that care and with the follow through, people can really move on to, you know, a different space in their life. And that's what I'd like to see happen. But like I said, I want to kind of get a picture of what are the funding sources that are doing that now, what kind of funding is needed, and what is the best use of that money. So I guess a follow-up with UCAN would be important to me.
So you'd want to hear what their plans are?
Yeah, I would just, you know, it's just one of those things of accountability. I do know that UCAN gets money. I don't know how UCAN spends money. I don't know any of those things. And as a person who is, you know, tasked with, you know, looking into that, it's just really hard without any numbers or anything to have an idea of money that's available, how is it being spent. what is the best way for us to step in and help. You know, everything just kind of seems what's nefarious. There's nothing to hold on to, and that's what I want, is some numbers to hold on to move forward.
I think it's nebulous.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, somebody over here? No, Vanessa?
I would agree, Val, that pretty soon it's going to be October and November, and we have tools right now in our belt that are just sitting idle, and it feels like quite the waste to have $1 million at our disposal for this. And also, I believe it's 20 to 25 emergency pallet shelters. So I think the council needs to get creative working with these community partners and figuring out how we can deploy these tools so that they're not just sitting idle through the winter months. It'll be here before we know it.
Brian?
Yeah, I would agree. I want to know how UCAN can help. I also want to see, I think we're at the point now to where we don't want to rely on Rogue Retreat to have any further services than what we already have. So getting an idea of what other organizations might be able to help, including UCAN, including potentially even organizations that run these types of services in other parts of the state, because there are those organizations, and even if they're not able or willing to directly run a facility here, they could, you know, they could at least assist us with getting something put together. So I would like to see, you know, what potential there is from other organizations besides Rogue Retreat, and even besides UCAN, because I don't want to, you know, put this all in the back of one partner again and then have them not be able to help, and then we're back at zero. So personally, I'd like to see if there's any other organizations in other parts of the state that are doing similar work that may be able to help in a similar way that Rogue Retreat has been helping. I would also really like to find a place for those pallet shelters. They've been sitting at the city yard unused. We've got $1 million, we've got pallet shelters, and we're just not using them, and that's tragic to me. So even if it's as simple as directing the city manager to find a place to put those up and have somebody run them, like, council doesn't need to figure it out. We just need to tell the city manager what we want to happen, and he can figure it out. We don't need to figure out all the details, but I definitely want something to happen this winter, and I will be sorely disappointed if those pallet shelters sit in the city yard unused again for another winter.
Joel?
So one of the things we can do is just give those shelters to Rogue Retreat or UCAN and let them do their job.
They are owned by UCAN.
They're UCAN shelter,
Yeah.
pallet shelters. We're just storing them for UCAN. Mayor, if I may, I have heard, it sounds like by more than one council member, I don't know what the consensus of council would be, that you may be interested in utilizing maybe some of your $1 million that we have for unhoused services. It would be an allowable cost if you were to utilize it for operations, if you wanted to use some of that money to do a stopgap measure until they determine additional funding for a shelter. It sounded like that's what some of you were sort of talking about, and I didn't want to.
Valerie?
Yeah, well, that's why, like you said, the shelters, pallet shelters belong to UCAN. UCAN hasn't totally disappeared because they're functioning up in Douglas County, and they were Josephine County. So I think it's important that we get together with UCAN or with somebody and come up with some solution. And if that means spending part of $1 million to house through this winter, then I would agree that that may be a way. Whether, I don't know if anybody, if there's anything, you know, whether there's any land available at the Foundry Village to set up a few, or if there's land, whatever. I mean, I don't know, but I'm just saying, as Vanessa said, I don't want to wait till the middle of October, November, when the storms start, to start scrambling to figure it out. I want to do it now so that we can have something laid out, because it makes no sense to have $1 million sitting out there to help our homeless and not utilizing it in some way when the weather goes bad.
Was UCAN invited to be here today?
Yes, we cannot get a hold of UCAN. They do not return calls and contacts. We actually got the Department of Administrative Services Director, I think, on board. Was that the gentleman we met with the other day?
From HUD?
The HUD house, yeah, HUD Director, to try to get a hold of UCAN because we are having difficulty getting a hold of the office.
Okay. Joel?
Yeah, I've had the same experience with my emails, and I think they've experienced a temporary loss in personnel, at least I hope it's temporary. But the same thing is happening with their emails as well.
Brian?
Yeah, I've actually physically gone down to their office twice and dropped a card and asked for a call back, and I haven't gotten one either, so they're kind of off the radar right now, which doesn't give me a lot of hope for them stepping in quickly to pick up the ball on this. Maybe they will, but all signs are indicating that they may not. So I guess we can reach out to them again and see, but we need to have a plan B ready because plan A is looking pretty shaky.
Okay, well, we have a couple of different things, I guess, that we're talking about. One is, how to keep the current Grants Pass shelter funded through the winter. And then another question would be whether we're going to do something more. So I guess in the absence of UCAN, as a kind of a absence of information about UCAN right now, I guess we need some suggestions for how to move forward. Do you want to set up a committee? Do you want to do another workshop? Are we all just going to sit here and wring our hands and say we should do something and not have any concrete ideas? Brian?
So as I understand it, as Lisa said, the funding mechanisms for Foundry are pretty solid, so I don't think we need to necessarily worry about that. The shelter it's a little up in the air right now, but they have a grant application that they're waiting to hear back on for funding for the next 6 months, which will get them through winter. And then I believe there's another funding source after that that is likely going to come through that will fund them for another year. So as long as they get that grant here in the next month, they should be pretty set for the next year and a half, as I understand it. Is that fairly accurate?
That's my understanding from Sam, yes.
Okay. So assuming that comes through, we probably don't need to spend any of that $1 million on the shelter, and the shelter can hopefully be self-sustaining for the next year and a half. I would be in favor of continuing to pursue property for additional services because both of those sites, there's not really any room for expansion, and the need for services is more than what those two sites can provide. And generally in the long term, it's going to be better for our position in the lawsuit if we get more of these services up and running. So I would still be in favor of looking for another site as we have been and as we almost got recently, whether it's a site that's been identified already or a different site. But I would think that it would be a good use of those funds to procure a site for expanded services once we find a provider. And then, if we can't find a provider in the next year or two, which sounds unlikely, but in that unlikely possibility, we can just sell that property and, not really have any loss. So I think that would be a low risk use of our money, and we could lay the groundwork for expanded services.
Joel?
Well, one of the things I think we need to do too, and this is outside of the city council, we'll get our community workshop back together and get Lisa and the other nonprofits together and discuss the existing situation and the desired situation and how we need to do that. One of the things we need to do is not outrun our headlights in terms of, I think there's still some things unsettled right now in terms of funding, in terms of legal, in terms of economic viability, those kind of things. And I think those will be settled out, as Brian mentioned, and along with some other items that address economic viability and legal issues. As we move forward, the social acceptability, economic viability, technical feasibility has never been a problem. It's very technically possible. And so we have to work on those two things of the economic viability and the social acceptability. And without either of those two things, it won't work. So we'll call our group back together again, Lisa, and I appreciate you participating with us and see what we do and where it goes. And it'll involve all members of our community, including the Honorable Rosa, I hope. Rose. Yeah, she's an inspiration. So
Vanessa?
I second Councilor De La Grange's idea for support on moving forward.
With purchasing a property?
And reaching out to outside service providers outside of the Rogue Valley that are doing similar work, either for assistance or creative solutions on how to move forward with property and these pallet shelters.
Valerie?
Well, the one thing that concerns me is that without operating expenses and without operating a piece of land, just buy a piece of land is not really helping the homeless if we don't have it secured to be run by someone. So to me, to move forward, to buy a piece of property is working backwards. The first part would be to come up with a community plan of social acceptance, because that's been part of our issue. You know, even if we find a piece of land, somebody else buys it up to prevent the social acceptability of it being there. So that's been an issue that needs to be dismissed, is the communication about how is it run, who is going to run it, and that sort of thing. So to me, the community conversation has got to be the first thing that comes forward. And at that time, if you want to bring some people down to, run it, but just because you have somebody up in Portland doesn't mean they want to come down and run a shelter in Grants Pass. So without knowing the operation, how the operation is going to run, to me, it makes absolutely no sense to buy a piece of property. So that's the issue that I have, because we've been around that road many times, and it just keeps blowing up in our face. So until you have that social acceptance and people on board, and them knowing what it's going to be, the property will do us no good.
Vanessa?
I can completely understand where you're coming from. The way that I see it is it's almost like getting the kitchen prepped for the chef, and we have our dominoes in an order so that the social service provider could come in and provide that service, and it's not an additional hurdle that's going to take 3 more months for us to get figured out. So I think if we're able to knock that out of the way, I think that could help streamline those services. We also have been having these community discussions for quite some time. I think there is always going to be some type of attitude in our community that homeless people should cease to exist. And it's not a policy decision that this council can continue to buy onto. We have to move past that, and we have to be leaders in expanding the services that our community needs.
Rob?
Yeah, I really, it's funny, how could I agree with everyone? But I pretty much do, but I think one of the main points of emphasis that I think I agree with is Brian's suggestion that we reach out to organizations outside of this immediate area for any ideas that they may have. And, we're not reinventing the wheel in Grants Pass. I'm sure that almost every problem that we've had here with homeless, with the possible exception of being under the gun of an injunction, but most of the other problems other communities have faced. So I'm not exactly sure how we would do that. I would imagine that's something that city staff would have to do, most efficiently would do, is to reach out to other parts of the country, other cities, either our size or much larger or smaller, and get a sense of who's taking care of this issue, and what recommendations they may have for us to move forward. It's tempting to say get a piece of property, but I'm just not sure if that's the right way to do it. But I'd like to hear, in the same way that we'd heard from what I would call the experts at Rogue Retreat and looked at their model, and we're very inspired by it. Originally, I'm hoping that we can be inspired by a similar group that may be able to give us some other suggestions. Whether or not they'd be willing to come here and, help us physically implement it is another question. But I think looking for expertise is something that we have to do. And I think that would be up to us, the council, to give staff direction, on.
Brian?
So, to me, it makes sense, to get the property first. I think it would make it easier to get a provider if we already have a site and it's ready for them to step in and utilize. It's just going to be one less hurdle to get over later. So, to me, the order is not as important because we're going to need all the pieces before it's up and running. So, the order is it doesn't seem as important to me. And in this whole thing, the property, up until the very end here has been the most difficult part. So, so if we have the ability and an opportunity to knock that piece of the puzzle out, it makes sense that we should do that.
Well, we have about half of the council participating in this discussion, but we're not really getting anywhere. 2 people are interested in moving forward with buying a property. We have 3 people interested in exploring what other organizations outside of the area do. Maybe 4 of you talking about organizations within the community. Pretty much we're looking at doing nothing. That's what we're looking at.
What do you think, Rick?
Well, as I said before, for spending $1 million, I'd like to see it for housing. I think I would like some individual in the community could step up with a property and offer it for the campground if it's to be. I realize we have some major challenges with staffing it and coming up with somebody to run it. But, so my vote is still in there for $1 million for providing housing. Thank you.
What do you mean by housing?
Housing is a major issue here right now just because of lack of availability of rentals and homes. I don't know what percentage of the homeless people out there, if they had rentals that they could afford, they wouldn't be homeless. So I see.
So are you talking about building apartments, or is it shelter housing, or paying for somebody's first and last month rent, or what are we talking about?
It could be a combination, but ultimately I would like to see multifamily built for that very purpose.
Okay, so we do have some money set aside from the ARPA funds for housing, but you're talking about also using the $1 million that we were talking about for a campground property for affordable housing.
I'm talking about using the $1 million towards transitional housing, which is different from the campground. As I said, the campgrounds I've looked at in Eugene, in fact, even Medford, they did not have to buy those campgrounds. The property was available to them.
In the past year and a half that we've been discussing this, has anyone offered property?
They did in Medford, but no, I have not heard of anybody here in Grants Pass offering it. That's true.
All right.
Thank you.
Valerie.
Well, it seems like we put together a task force for everything else, and I know that they can be long, but I think the first start is to have a forum, a community discussion, and bring in people from the community and talk about it, and bring in some of those community members that were at the discussion we had. I mean, there was a lot of people that were passionate about homeless that was at the workshop. that Joel and I, a lot of people, and they want to be a part of it. And part of their frustration is that they felt that the county, that the councilors were going to do what they wanted to do because they didn't really want to listen to what they had to say. So in some ways, it added more of a divide as opposed to coming together, which was our original hope. So seeing as we're at this roadblock, I think personally it's a good time to come back into this community center, which was where that forum was held, and said, okay, where are we going to go? These are the resources. At that point in time, we travel up, find somebody at the navigation center for UCAN and say, tell us what you're doing in Douglas County. What is your experience in Douglas County? I mean, we bring a couple people who, like you said, in other parts are doing it and have that discussion. But I think that is what we need to do, is have that community discussion right here in the chamber with people from all sides to have a discussion.
Brian.
We've been having a community discussion about this for a year and a half already. We are the elected officials of this city. The people have elected us to take care of the issues that the city faces. The people have plenty of opportunities to communicate their opinions and ideas to us all the time. When I hear bringing together a task force or another community group, I hear a punt. I hear that we're passing the buck, and I hear that we're not courageous enough to address this problem as the leaders of this community. So I oppose that idea.
Joel.
So one of the things in our homeless mitigation plan, work closely with community partners to create tiered levels of self-sufficient oriented housing, including transitional to permanent residency, where participants are required to participate in self-reliant work training courses, receive mental health, additional counseling, and continued progress in order to remain getting help. Open more case-managed beds, or units, beds, apartments, navigation centers, safe parking, etc. Explore more options for rapid rehousing and housing. First strategy. Let me repeat that. Explore more options for rapid rehousing and housing. Develop more affordable housing, meaning housing that costs less than 30% of the income of people making at or below the AMI, and workforce housing, 80 to 120% AMI, annual mean income, for those that aren't used to that. Invite all groups that want to provide services of housing, both short and long-term, to come to the table. And somebody added on to it, give them permits at no cost to build or remodel location. So it's not a question of either or, it's a question of and. And then it's a question of timeliness and of coordination. And it has to involve all the members of the community as we go together. It's not punting, it's working together as a community to solve our problems. One of the things that strikes me, and this is an overused idiom, and I apologize, to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results is not a good strategy. So we need to be smart, we need to move ahead, we need to accomplish some good in our mitigation of the homelessness that we have, and if you want me to get to specifics, I could.
Rob.
You know, I hear, again, I hear and agree with everyone, but, you know, I hear what you're saying, Brian, about essentially we've been focusing on this problem for a year and a half, and so far we haven't really done anywhere near as much as we would have liked. I like the idea of potentially forming a task force. What does concern me about it, and you know, I'm not particularly interested, and people will, you know, hang me for this, but I'm not particularly interested in having people on the task force who don't want to solve the problem. And there's some percentage of the people who are in that, in the homeless mitigation group, the meetings that Joel and Valerie had, some percentage of them as Vanessa said, just wish that the homeless didn't exist. But the fact is they do, and the fact is we're trying to do something to potentially offer a hand up and potentially improve our situation, improve their situation. So I'm concerned with, I would call it a waste of time if we're going to spend months hearing from people who want to do nothing or want the homeless to go away or wish that we were not under an injunction or wish that we just threw them out of the park and took our chances in federal court. So I'm not interested in trying to roll that wheel again, so to speak. But I think that there are probably members of the community that could help us with this, especially when it comes to listening to representatives from other areas and what they've done. But I like the idea of a task force. I really don't like the idea of members of that task force being of the mindset that we should do nothing or the homeless should go away. And we know exactly, I mean, you all know exactly what faction I'm talking about, because that doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the homeless, it doesn't help our city, it doesn't help the police, it doesn't help the council. So we need to choose members of that task force carefully, people that actually want to be positive and want to be proactive and create a solution. If that were the case, I'd be behind forming a task force, but it would have to be very carefully chosen people that actually want a positive solution here, rather than just want to vent or wish that our reality was different. So I'm for a task force for a relatively short period of time, and I think that the members of that need to be chosen very carefully. And not because I want to be in an echo chamber or just hear what I want to hear, but I think we all agree that, as Joel was saying, continue to do the same thing over and over again, or basically doing nothing, is getting us nowhere. So I want people that actually would want to help solve this problem be on such a task force, so that we don't waste our time with it.
Kurt. Kurt, are you out there?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. First, I want to concur with Rob's characterization of the consensus group. That's exactly accurate. And then it seems like we've moved past this, but I just want to say that, up to this point, we've had a partner we thought was rock solid, and the only thing that kept us from moving forward was having land. And now we're at this point, we don't have it. I think that, I would certainly like to move forward with securing that part of it and then expanding our search for a partner outside the area, because I think there are other solutions that we aren't aware of. So I would concur with that motion.
I'm not sure. Is DJ on today? No. Brian.
Just so we can get somewhere, I'll make a motion to direct staff to bring to us properties that could potentially be used for purchase for this purpose, and getting more information regarding service providers in our community and outside of our community that would be able to help assist in the running of such facility, and the convening of a task force with selected members that can help us work to solve this problem, with that task force having a very short time span of maybe even just a couple of months, maybe meeting weekly or every other week, so we can get some results quickly.
Is there a second? Second from Rob. Any discussion on the motion? Joel.
So one of the things that strikes me, and we've talked about this a lot, and we've done nothing on it. And to do nothing really is unacceptable. To emphasize that, I just had somebody come up to me this morning whose son was visiting from Nevada, and they went down to the river, and anywhere they went on the river, there was, in their words, I wasn't there, but in their words, there were people that were kind of scary and using drugs and all that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean they're homeless. They may have been or may not have been. But to do nothing is not acceptable. As we move forward in terms of social and economic viability, in the long run, just providing housing won't be enough. You got to have jobs that people can afford housing, you know, and you look at the GI Bill, what happened after people came back from World War II and the American dream of owning your own home, and there's a lot of people now that have lost hope on that. And it's a little different country than it was back then. But as we move forward and we look at this hurdle, there is that next hurdle, and how can we set the stage as we cross this hurdle to make that second hurdle even easier? Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do that, you know, depending on where you choose the land, depending on the infrastructure that is built to support it, that may also support some economic development, and the social acceptability of having a workforce then that can go from not having a home to having a job to having affordable housing. So anyway, that's kind of my vision of where we're at and where we're going. And for us to go off right now and just buy some property because it could be used, and we could put pallet shelters on there if we find somebody to run it, may or may not fit within that long-term strategy. And we may have had a lost opportunity. So I'll be voting no on the motion.
Further discussion on the motion? Valerie.
Yeah, this is such a tough one because, you know, we have gone out, we've given the staff the opportunity to go out and look for pieces of property. Trust me, they did go out and look for property. There's not a lot of property out there that fits our criteria. Sadly enough, most people said, gee, it should be in an economic area. You know, let's put it out by Spalding, that seems to work. And who worked against us then was the church. So, you know, that to me is where this community is at. Is that you've got, on one hand, you know, people saying, you know, when I was at the workshop, I'd say 70% of the people at that workshop were all for. They were in total support of doing something. So, you know, for people who were not at the workshop to say that, you know, there's going to always be a few naysayers. And I think most of us who are at the workshop are aware that there's going to be a few naysayers and that's going to happen. But the majority of people at that workshop were community-minded people that really want to come up with a solution. So I'm a little bit dismayed, you know, at that. And yes, we know there's a contingent, and it makes me sad that the contingent, that one of the biggest contingents fighting against it is our local churches. And that is where we're at. Because to me, putting something close to the industrial zone or whatever, and having transportation is important. I mean, we have all the pieces and parts. We just sometimes have to be able to sit in a room and have a conversation with those people there too, and say it to all of us why that place doesn't work. And that's what's difficult in this community, is because we always kind of have to walk around, and we really can't say what we really want to politically say. I mean, that is a pretty sad statement, that the piece of property that we did have out there was a piece of property that one of our major churches bought so that we could not put a homeless shelter out there. I mean, and I think the community needs to know that that's what we're up against. So that's where I feel like you just need to air the dirty laundry. Bring it in here and talk about it. And I think the majority of community members will rise to the occasion and say, yes, let's do something and move forward. I mean, a task force, it should be 4 meetings. Give us a month and a half. Have a community conversation. Be willing to say ugly things and get it out on to get it out in the public, so we can all know where we feel about it and who are the bad actors. I don't know, but obviously we have them. So, you know, I'm in support of putting together a task force. I'm not sure that I want to handpick those people, because I think that's the problem, is we have people wanting to handpick who's going to have a say in what's going to happen. And that has been our problem, is because we have factions on both sides, but the majority of people are in the middle. And so you need to let the people hear it so that they know the bad actors, and they know where we're at as a community. So I'm open to having a task force. I don't know why that has to be. We can't have a community discussion and bring people to the table right here to have, you know, to find out what the problems and what it is that's hindering them from moving forward. But there's not a lot of pieces of property. So to me, it's just kicking the can down the road, handing it over to the staff and saying, oh, go find a piece of property. We did that. And then we decided to give it to Go Retreat. When Rogue Retreat can't do, I mean, the All Care Foundation, they couldn't come up with anything either. They're feeling just frustrated because there's no place here. So what we need to do is have a discussion and bear it all out and really talk about it. And that's why, to me, just doing task force and giving the staff this and that, you know, I think you bring the service providers in here, you have a forum where they talk about it, you bring somebody else in, and we hash it out in the next month and a half and come up with a solution. And I think it needs to happen right here in City Council chambers.
Kurt.
Yeah, just in comment to what Valerie just said, I just want to remind her that I was an active participant in the workshop, and that's where my comments come from. Also, just to correct, you mentioned, Sarah, that nobody had offered us property. And the fact is, we did get 2 offers of property, one on Clover Lawn and one on Merlin Galeese. Unfortunately, they were just in the wrong location to be useful for us. So there's other places in town that we could be using, and we just need to be creative and go after them. Thanks.
Brian.
Yeah, I would just like to also remind council that, you know, for all the argument that there's property that it's difficult to find a property, we were presented a viable property just a few weeks ago, and for purchase, and it met all the criteria, and council decided to not move on it. I don't know if that property is still available, but I don't think that that is a waste of time, especially if that property is available. Somebody has to look for property. Somebody has to procure the property, and we need the property to move forward ultimately with any sort of project. So the sooner we get that done, the better.
Rob.
So to clarify, you know, I think Valerie was criticizing my characterization of the community meetings about the this situation. To clarify, I believe the council wants to move forward in a positive way in some direction. And my point is, I don't see any real valid reason to have people that don't have that same goal be part of the task force. In other words, I wouldn't want to, you know, if we wanted to build more baseball fields, I wouldn't put someone on the task force who hates baseball, you know, or I wouldn't put someone on the task force who's anti athletics. So, you know, if somebody wants to testify or talk to us or send emails about all the reasons we should do nothing for the homeless and all the reasons they don't deserve it, they're still free to do it. But if we're going to move forward and be positive about it, I don't really want to waste time with a group. And I would call it wasting time. If we want to be positive and move forward and do any of the actions that we're talking about doing, I don't really want to, in those meetings, those same meetings, be slowed down by people who are just going to find reasons to disagree with whatever it is that's brought up that's positive. They'll have their chance later to speak, but I just don't, to me, that's a waste of time. And that's where I was coming from on it. I wasn't saying that that entire group was a waste of time, but I'm saying as we move forward, I think that hearing from people that absolutely want to do nothing for the homeless except wish they would disappear, I think that that's a waste of time, because that, I don't think, is the direction that the council wants to go.
Brian, since you made the motion, what's your vision for the task force? Would you be open to the suggestion of just doing it as a whole council rather than as a separate committee?
I don't have any problem with that. I don't think it needs to be a separate committee, but it should include council and pertinent, relevant community members that want to help solve this problem.
So if we picked up on Valerie's idea of spending 6 weeks or so with a series of meetings with community involvement and just tackling the task force as a council, can we amend that to be your motion?
Yeah, that sounds fine.
Okay. Any further discussion on this at the moment? We have hands up? No. Okay, so there's a 3-part motion, which would be to direct staff to search for potential properties. And I don't think you clarified campground or indoor specific. Do you want to clarify that?
Not necessarily. I think if there is any property available that meets the criteria that we have set previously, that should be brought to council for consideration.
Okay, so any potential shelter, indoor or outdoor?
Yes.
Okay. So it has 3 parts. The first is to search for potential shelter locations, both indoor and outdoor. The second part is to gather more information on potential service providers, both in and outside of the local community. And the third part is to establish, we'll call it just a council task force, or our workshops and meetings for a month or 6 weeks to focus on this issue. Any questions? Any further discussion? All right, Aaron has a question.
The city identified property, I think it's clear, and we'll be able to provide you with some potential options to look at. They could be properties we've already considered and maybe some new ones. The piece associated with determining service providers both in and outside the city. We could potentially find service providers in and outside the city. And it really depends on how you approach that question. If you approach the question of, are you willing to come in, and if we have a site, will you provide the service, is a question. Another question is, are you willing to come in if we find a site, and will you provide the service? And there's going to be an associated cost more than likely with any of those service providers. So are we looking at inquiring upon their cost? Are we looking at it, because there's bandwidth questions and issues associated with some of the service providers. Say we reach out to the multiple service providers that are in Eugene. They're like, yeah, I'm not really interested. Well, what if we pay you this? Or what if we, where am I going with that perspective? I just wanted some guidance. When I have a discussion with these individuals, it's extremely cursory if I just say, hey, can you provide services? Well, yeah, I could provide services. It's just like, hey, is your house for sale? No, it's not. Well, but if I pay you this, you bet it's for sale. It's the same thing here. If we start throwing out a number of this is what we're willing to provide for services, you could get someone internally that, from an internal perspective, that would gear up and ramp up to provide the service. So I'm just wanting clarity on it because I don't want to get out in front of council when I start asking service providers, and I don't want to be out in front of council with the perspective of where are we going, who's actually going to be holding that contract, and at what cost.
Brian?
So I think my idea with that is to just see who else is operating in the state, and just inquire as to their ability to take on projects, and At this point, it's more of a high level. I don't want us to be offering any operational funding at this point. I think that's something that we could decide to do later if we need to. But up until now, we haven't been operating under the assumption that we would be providing any operational funding, and I would like to continue operating under that assumption until those possibilities have been exhausted. So it's more just seeing who else is operating in the state and what capacity they have to potentially provide assistance or run additional sites with their organizational capacity. Is that clear enough?
I think that helps. And part of that clarity is, I know a few months ago during Christmas time, council said, hey, we want a warming center. Aaron, make a warming center happen. And within a week, we had a warming center, a shelter. If council said, Aaron, make an urban campground happen in 6 months, we'd have an urban campground in 6 months. There'd be decisions from a cost perspective, et cetera. So there's a lot associated with the direction that I'm trying to get from council, so I know what responsibility we're going to be taking on, so I can have that conversation and come to the table as a viable individual that people are going to want to talk to and spend some time with me in getting some information or potential numbers when we're associated with services for this type of service.
So I think my goal with this three-part motion is to kind of make progress on all the pieces at the same time, because we're going to need the land, so that's pretty straightforward as far as looking and identifying that. The task force and identifying service providers, I'm hoping will kind of dovetail together where we can use the community partners and potentially a service provider to hopefully come together to provide a solution here if one or the other is not able to do so on their own. So I just want to get all the pieces moving so we can get something to stick.
I guess I would characterize that second part, I see it as more exploratory at this point, just seeing what options are. If there are any chains or, groups in the state, it sounds like Brian's wanting, that provide this kind of service, and just letting us know, there's, this is who runs it in Eugene, this is how it works. A little bit of background info. We've just only been talking about Rogue Retreat so far, so we need to know what some other possibilities are, and maybe there's other local organizations. I mean, we do have some other shelters, women's shelters and things in town, and whether they have any capacity to expand, if they already have some kind of an institutional knowledge about how to run shelters. Is that getting at the heart of what you wanted before we vote on this?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got our three parts. Questions, comments? Rob?
Yeah, Aaron, another, I would assume, but maybe not, that's why I'm saying it, another part of that would be if you were to contact people in Eugene or whatever, how much per person do they spend on homeless situation or shelter or an urban campground or anything of that nature? In other words, what would the cost be to Grants Pass? Because right now we have no idea. So just what do they spend? Whether was the city of Bend spend or city of Eugene or whatever,
Okay, well, before we spend a whole lot of time, let's vote and see if it's even worth talking. Brian, you made the motion, and how do you vote?
Yes.
Valerie?
Yes.
Rick?
I'm voting no because I feel staff shouldn't be getting into this business or the city, and we have capacity within the existing shelters. Thank you.
Joel?
I vote no.
Rob?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Kurt?
Yes.
Okay, motion passes 5-2. Any further discussion on this issue? Okay. Thanks for tackling that, everyone. Next up, Allen Creek Road rezone.
All right, good morning. So we're back to discussion about Allen Creek. Just so the council and mayor, you can be thinking as I'm walking through kind of some of the background here, that at the end of the day, what we're really going to be asking for your thoughts on today is whether you want to spend about $28,000 to proceed with a traffic impact analysis. I mean, that's the punchline here. We're going to have to come up with some additional funding if you indeed want to see Allen Creek rezoned by the city. That's kind of where we're at, and we'll be asking for some guidance on that direction. So just wanted to give you that up front. We're here to give you an update on the Allen Creek Road area and the rezone, and it relates to your goal to facilitate sustainable, manageable growth by increasing the supply of urban zone land for development. A lot of this you've seen in the last 6 to 8 months, so I won't spend too much time on it, but we do have these 5 sub-areas that we started in about 1.5 years ago looking at rezoning. We ended up at this point focusing just on Southwest C, it's what it's called, which is the Allen Creek area. That direction was given back in October when you gave direction to reduce from 540 acres down to just the Allen Creek. And that was largely driven because of the exorbitant costs that it would take to get a transportation impact analysis for all 540 acres. Because as you'll see, just for Allen Creek, we're looking at about 60,000, and that's just 60 acres. So we took your feedback. We went back to Housing Advisory Committee, went back to the Urban Planning Commission. That was in November and December of last year. What we ended up with, there's kind of 2 numbers here that I think are important. We're talking about the 35 parcels that are in this area. All of which is outside the city limits. This is all in the urban growth boundary, and all has county zoning except for the 5 acres that's at the corner of Harbeck and Allen Creek. That's the only one that has city zoning. But the other figure I wanted to point out was the number of underdeveloped parcels. So there's 27. So we have 35 parcels in this area total, and 27 of them are underdeveloped, meaning there's more than a half acre of land that only has 1 house. So we have quite a few larger parcels that have pretty limited development. As you're aware, there are several of them do need some work. There's several that are, one of which the city recently acquired for the Allen Creek project. Which we have worked on. But there's basically, the point here is that there's a lot of potential for development in this area. So on January 10th of this year, we did present the feedback to you from the Housing Advisory and the Planning Commission. They basically, those 2 groups had full consensus to proceed with examining 3 different scenarios out there. One was just, when I say examine a scenario, I mean in terms of traffic, the traffic impact, which is what all of this is kind of coming down to before we can really move forward. So we talked about a baseline, which is just all of that 61 acres R2 zoning. We talked about a maximum upzone of R4 for all of it, and then kind of a strategic mixed zoning. So these 3 maps were presented. You can see kind of up here at the corner of Allen Creek and Harbeck, which is at the center of the top of this slide here, and then it heads south to Denton Trail, kind of at the bottom. The higher density zoning today that is designated in the comprehensive plan is all at the north end. That's the higher density residential. Everything else in the comp plan is medium density. So what we did was we assumed this kind of a mix of some R2, R3, and R4, and went to the traffic engineer with that. And said, can you kind of look at that as well as kind of a baseline and the other, but we wanted to see really what this would end up with. So David Evans and Associates is the consultant that the city's been working with. And they, based on that feedback, did prepare a scoping memo, which in the transportation planning world basically says, here's what we're planning to analyze. Do you think that looks good? So prior to going ahead, and staff thought this was a good idea, so we agreed, they wanted to kind of give this scoping memo to ODOT staff to have them look at it, because at the end of the day, if ODOT's not on board, we're back to square one. So before we spent too much time and money, we did do that. What did that scoping memo say? I won't go into all this, it's in your slides there, but basically we assumed kind of this mix of densities. The baseline for this whole thing would be, okay, you can do 35 units today, because it's county zoning. You can do only 1 unit per parcel today. There's 35 lots, 35 trips, or 35 dwelling units assumed. So that's sort of your current today baseline. And then the max density, we went back and forth on this, but ended up going with 650 dwellings for that 61 acres. And that would be a range of, multifamily, keeping the city-owned land there. We know that council hasn't made any decisions on that, but some of it is park reserve land, so we did assume some park reserve in there. That would provide some open space for the future development in the Allen Creek area. But we ended up kind of zeroing in on that number, 650 units. And then put a trip cap that would basically, using 650 units, and then we use 0.51 units or trips per unit, which is standard in the industry, and then a forecast year of 2040. We assume 262 multifamily units out of that 650. Also assume that all of the improvements that are in the city's transportation system plan, which was adopted back in October of 2020, that all improvements that are in that plan would be made within the 20-year time frame. We also looked at a difference in trip counts between the current and the proposed zoning and what that might end up with. It ended up resulting in 299 net new PM peak hour trips, which really is just saying, you've got some traffic today, you've got some base traffic, and then what's the new zoning? What's the difference between what is potential for zoning and what we're proposing for zoning? What's the difference in those traffic counts? So that would 299 net new peak hour trips. The intersections that they have been looking at there's 12 of them here shown on the slide. The top 4 involve Highway 199. The bottom 4 involve Highway 238. And then we have Allen Creek at Albertsons, at Schutzwall, at West Harbeck, and at New Hope. So those all 12 intersections would be looked at. I apologize, these green arrows didn't come out very well, but basically this is just showing what the assumed trip distribution, again, this green area here is what we're talking about in terms of the Allen Creek area. So you can see, some trips are assumed to go south down to New Hope. Some would be kind of coming out Harbeck and then coming out down here, but the majority would be going up towards Highway 199 to go either east or west. So we gave all of that information to ODOT, and then on May 24th, ODOT's lead engineer for this area, Mr. Michael Wang, replied with some technical comments, but at the end of the day, his point was, you are not going to be able to use any of the assumptions from your existing transportation system plan. He says that data is 6, 7, 8 years old. Your traffic counts, your safety issues, your accident rates, some of the other things. He said, sorry, you can use it, which was our assumption all along. We had just adopted a transportation system plan in October of 2020. That's the data we were going to use. ODOT said no. So that meant that our traffic engineer is going to have to collect all this new data, get new, traffic counters out there and look at other kind of modeling. There's also an upgrade in the model that ODOT wanted us to use rather than the previous model, transportation model. So that's going to take some time and energy. So basically where we are is we have this $53,000 project to get the transportation done, study done. You had already approved a $36,500 contract, and we've been working with DEA. All of the stuff that I've presented here so far, has been part of that. But there is still a balance of $25,000 in that contract. So we can put that towards the $53,000, so that leaves $28,000 needed to complete the TIA. Once they get the green light, it's probably about 3 to 5 months. DEA's got some other projects, so that would be from a notice to proceed, not including, our review or ODOT review. So you can probably add another, 6 to 8 weeks on there. So what are some of the factors that could be used to decide whether or not to proceed or not? There's a few up here on the screen for the council to think about. The first one there is syncing the rezone with the Allen Creek Road widening project. So there certainly is some benefit, as that project moves along. We have bid construction is estimated for fall of '23 with construction in 2024. And what we have heard from some of the developers and property owners out in the Allen Creek area is, we know this is coming. It's been coming for 10 years, but we know that you're getting closer. The plans are coming along, and assuming that we're going to stay on target, which we should be. We don't have any reason to think we wouldn't be. You have the construction of Allen Creek going from its current, small 2-lane county road to a full-blown 70-foot wide city road with bike lanes, curb gutter sidewalks on the whole stretch. So, we know that when that happens, that often is an incentive for developers when all of that road work is done and built out. So at this point, that would probably be looking around, that late '24 when that project would be done. So there's some benefit there in terms of syncing this. With this rezone certainly could be done long prior to the finish product of Allen Creek, if you gave us that direction. Number two there is, just kind of a cost benefit thing. Do you think that it's worth the cost of the city using general fund money? If you chose to do that, you technically could use some ARPA funds as well, I suppose, but $53,000 to rezone this compared to the community benefits. Number three there is the Land Conservation Development Commission did recently adopt the climate-friendly and equitable community rules. Those may add some additional pieces to a TIA analysis. I asked DEA if they could get a hold of DLCD staff and kind of explore that. We don't have an answer on that yet. It's possible. We can certainly keep you updated, but that may, if there's a trigger in there for this size project, I personally would be surprised. I think most of those are for much larger impacts than what you would see on a 60-acre area, but it's a factor that we wanted to mention to council. And then number four, any rezone scenario that has R3 or higher would involve updating the comprehensive plan. That isn't a significant factor just because the amount of time to rezone and change the comprehensive plan is very similar. We can do them concurrently, but it is a little bit of extra effort there to do that. And then of course, just the level of council commitment on future funding to complete the rezone of the 540 acres. If you anticipate the city taking the lead on some of the other sub-areas on that map that I showed at the beginning, this is just one of those 5 sub-areas. There may be just a factor for you to think about there in terms of, if we proceed on this, do we want to proceed on the other 4 areas? Because and some of those are going to take a lot more time and energy than what this one has. We would have a model here, potentially, especially if we updated the transportation modeling that we could use that would be a benefit to other sub-areas. But again, just what is the weight that the council would want to put on that? The last one is just, potential owner survey to assess the level of neighborhood support or opposition to a rezone. Whether that would be a factor right now for the council. I don't think that you have raised any questions in there because we have been talking about this quite a long time, and I think the decision is there, but we also, this is just a reminder that, we have not gone out to the property owners to let them know that we're proceeding. So the call to action is there, $36,500 plus a new allocation of $28,000. The community development has that service other professional budget. It's got $30,600 left right now. We do need some of that to complete our wetlands analysis, which is mandated by the state, and we're about 75%, 80% done with that. So we do need some of the funding for that. And then we also have the Washington Lawn Ridge historic overlay, which we'd be looking to hire historic consultants for that. So some of that money is spoken for. So point is, we would need to identify some other sources of funding.
Thanks, Brad. Looks like Rick has a question.
Brad, can you go back to slide 3?
Way back.
It shows the 5 different areas. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different areas. So the original contract with Richard Evans, or I have the wrong, David Evans, included all those areas, correct? To review for the master transportation plan?
No, by the time this was our rezone application that we prepared, and then once we heard from ODOT that they would be requiring more transportation, that's when we brought in. But at that point, we had already narrowed it down to Allen Creek.
Right, because the council changed from doing all those areas to just concentrating on Allen Creek.
Right.
So if we want to move forward with our master transportation plan, how are we going to get our approval if we haven't reviewed all those other areas?
Well, there's a difference between the level of analysis that's required for a TSP and what's required for a rezone. The transportation planning rule has kind of 2 main areas. You're doing the planning side, but then you also do kind of the project side. And so this level of rezone triggers the project side, which is some additional analysis, including funding, which the larger planning side for TSP doesn't require that level of detail.
So my real question is, when we've reallocated all our monies to Allen Creek and we finish that project, where do we stand with ODOT getting our approval for our master transportation plan? What do we have to do to get that?
Are you saying master transportation plan, the TSP? Is that what you? So that's already been approved by ODOT. That's done and adopted.
I thought they would not accept it because they felt that the densities, we didn't portray the ultimate density for each zone. Where's my misunderstanding there?
Yeah, I think you may be conflating 2 different issues there, Counselor, because one of them, the the transportation system plan, we're good on. You know, I mean, you've talked about a potential amendment to that
Right.
at Dow, but on that plan, ODOT's good. What the concern became when we made the proposal for a rezone, which was a separate application from the TSP.
Okay, thank you.
Joel, then Valerie?
Thank you, Brad. Good presentation. I just had a question. Back on slide 17, item number 3. Of course, we're going to deal with that subject as well in the future. One of the rules on that, I guess it's already in place, whether or not it stays there or not, I guess might be a question, but one of the things it said, following the initial designation of climate-friendly areas, local governments shall maintain climate-friendly area zones with sufficient zoned residential building capacity to contain at least 30% of the current and projected housing needs. So the city of Grants Pass would do 2 things. One is they would designate some areas as climate-friendly area zones. And then the second thing is they have to have, within those zones, 30% of the existing and projected housing needs. And so when you look at areas like Allen Creek, I'm not sure it fits the need for a climate-friendly zone, but it does have some potential for satisfying housing needs. So how does that play, if we did that, into the transportation system, or the TIA? How does that play into making that TIA today? Or does it? Maybe it doesn't. We just go ahead on it anyway.
Well, yeah, I don't think it could have a nexus in that if we proceeded with the rezone and we would be able to use, say, the 650 number, projected 650 new units in that area, you know, that would certainly help towards the overall projected need, you know, meeting the overall need for housing. But I don't think there's a direct correlation between the climate-friendly areas because, you know, we still have a year and a half to designate those. And then at that point, you still have another year. I'm sorry, I don't have the dates in front of me, but it's a fairly long lead time that the state has given communities to designate and then create rules that are attached to those climate-friendly areas. So, you know, presumably this work, if you chose to proceed, would already be done, you know, in terms of the rezone. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Valerie?
Yeah, I have a question on that same slide, actually, because on number 4 it says, any rezone scenario that includes proposed zoning with R3 or higher will require updating the comprehensive plan use designations. So currently, that's all R2, except for that one little area, correct?
Yes. I probably should not have said any because the northern portion,
Right.
There's about five or six parcels that would not require a comp plan change, but all the rest would. And you're right, it's R2 or lower.
Okay, so that was my question, does that not infer that with us trying to put more mixed use on that land, that automatically that comprehensive plan will have to be modified or redone, the whole area? I mean, the kind of part, the whole reason that we chose this particular area to do the TIA and move forward, because number 1, we know we have a road being ready to be set there, which means that obviously that will bring in faster than any place else would, the possibility of upzoning and bringing in more housing to the area. It just seems to me that means that would be an assumption that we would be redoing the comp plan at the same time to bring in that level of housing, correct?
Right. No, I think you're correct. I guess that was more of just a reminder that we are going to need to be doing the comp plan because as this map shows, the purple is the the R3, and, anything below kind of where my cursor is here is in the
R2.
comp plan as R2. So if, we go with anything down in this area as more than R2, you're right, it's going to change the comp plan.
Okay, so that is a process that could go along at the same time as the road's being built, and we go ahead with the TIA for this area? I mean,
Right.
Would they all kind of work synonymously together at the same time?
Yeah, the comp plan amendment would, be married up with the rezone. Those two would go together.
Okay, that's my question, so thank you.
Brian?
Yep, thanks, Brad. My question is about how we're going to pay that extra amount for the TIA. And you mentioned that we could potentially use ARPA funding. Is there any potential for us to use any sort of transportation funds that we have in that bucket of money? As far as, I know we have dedicated road funds and things like that. Are those kinds of things that we could use for this?
I'm looking over at Jason to see if he has any thoughts. I mean, it's, I don't know what kind of flexibilities in some of that transportation money for paying for rezone analysis. I mean, it is a transportation impact analysis, so.
It is a transportation
it's related in
analysis.
that
We
way.
have never paid for that. Those have always been paid by the developers. We could look in to see whether those funds are eligible, but it's weird that cities don't typically rezone large parcels of land like this. I think Brad had talked about that early on. So I would have to look to see if the TSP fund or the transportation funds were available. I just would want to double check before I say yay or nay today.
Okay, thanks.
Joel?
So it seems to me like the infrastructure funds under ARPA, that this could be an appropriate use for those funds, where we've identified we wanted to help our housing crunch by aiding development using the ARPA funds for infrastructure. That seems like a good match.
That is, you have 1.6 million of your ARPA is designated towards that. There's a urban growth boundary, infrastructure improvements, and then of course the 3 million is just affordable housing in general. You did already kind of indicate your preference for the partnership with Josephine Housing Council and Jackson Housing Authority a couple weeks ago, that 3 million would kind of go towards multifamily development there. But yeah, the 1.6 seems like a reasonable fit for this area.
Other questions? All right, thanks. I have a question, Brad. Just what you need from us today. Do you need authorization for additional funds or any sort of direction today?
Right. I mean, I think we have put DEA on hold. They are not spending any money. We're not proceeding with this at all in case, the council just wanted to see us back out of the city-initiated rezone altogether. So, I mean, I think that's the first question. If you say, no, we don't want to back out, we want to see the city rezone this area, then yes, we would, I guess, we would have to come back to you with a specific pot of money, including the answer to your question to Jason.
Valerie?
Yeah, I would just say, to me, it would be a crime to back out, because at this point in time, we are counting on that for a lot of the housing needs moving forward. So to me, it's not a question of backing out. Unfortunately, that's just the way of the world right now. But this is a key part of moving forward with housing. And I would agree with Joel that, it'd be nice to find another fund, but the reality of it is this is the sort of thing that the ARPA fund for infrastructure is for. Because in a sense, by us doing this, we're saving the developer down the road from spending that money, which will help lessen the cost of whatever project they put in if the city does it. And this is at this point, I can see our big hope for significant housing development, especially multifamily and So I would say that I think it's important that we move forward. I think it's important that the ARPA funds be used, if nothing else is available, to get it started so that all of these things can happen together at the same time. So by the time that we do get done building the road, we have it rezoned and we have our comp plan ready to go so that development can happen sooner than later.
Brian?
Yeah, I'd be in favor of just reallocating some of those infrastructure ARPA funds to cover the difference.
Aaron?
Yeah, we are really unclear at the moment. I don't think ARPA dollars can be utilized for this. ARPA dollars are for infrastructure, water and sewer. ARPA dollars are also allowed for affordable housing. This does neither. And looking at funding sources from a transportation perspective, we don't believe transportation funds could be utilized for this either because it's a spot rezone. So therefore, we're choosing a location that has good potential redevelopment, but it's a small pocket compared to the other pockets also. If we were to do, from a methodology perspective, we're doing all rezone, then we'd have a stronger argument for utilizing potentially transportation dollars. But at this point, we're choosing a location that has high development potential that the developers and property owners in that area will benefit from only. So I think the safest use of dollars would be for us to identify general fund dollars to do this. I don't believe ARPA would be an allowable use for this. And transportation doesn't seem to be an allowable use because we're spot rezoning. So it looks like general fund would probably be your safest bet.
Okay. I guess with that in mind, does council want staff to move forward with identifying some general funds to take care of this? Brian?
I feel like we have to do this, so whatever the city manager thinks is the most appropriate funding source, I would just say go with that.
Joel?
I agree.
All right, does anybody want to disagree? All right, looks like they're in support of you tracking down some funds to take care of that. I think that's the only decision we really need to make today, isn't it? All right. Any other comments on that issue? No, okay. Next up then, agenda review. And we have a workshop coming up next week where we will discuss amending the amount of deposits that developers pay when they're for trees. That's a it was a tree advisory committee, I think, recommendation. Okay, tree advisory committee recommendation that the deposits are less than the cost of the trees at this point. So we'll bring some information about that, as well as a discussion on the zoning transition overlay. And then the following week is Labor Day, so we won't have a workshop that week, but then we have the September 7th meeting. Acquired quite a few of the consent calendar items from last week's meeting that was canceled. First up is a public hearing, an ordinance that would be a property line vacation on a Rogue River Highway property. A public hearing to consider annexing Rogue Community College. Council action item is a resolution to approve the Bragg grant. An ordinance, council action item for an ordinance on an annexation on Briggs Way. Council action on resolution approving the replacement water treatment plant design services. And then the consent calendar, this next one, is that different than what we're handling today? I think it is. Okay. So the first consent calendar item is a resolution on safe drinking water revolving fund application. Then a resolution to award resurfacing, funds for resurfacing the Lawn Ridge Courts a resolution on right-of-way services agreement, a resolution establishing a hearings office for park exclusions, a resolution for water treatment plant solids hauling, a resolution to transfer ARPA funds to the water treatment plant, a resolution on a grant for an air scrubber and emergency shelter that we discussed last week, and motion approving findings of fact from a public hearing on something we did recently. Redwood Hotel, okay, thank you, the adult business ordinance. Then we have some committee appointments for the Housing Advisory Committee, the Historic Building and Sites Commission, and the Collaborative Economic Development Committee. That gets us through the next 2 weeks. Any questions about any of those items? All right. We discussed earlier in today's meeting that we're going to need to tackle homeless issues as a council, so I see that coming up on multiple meetings this fall, but are there other items that you would like to see us handle? Brian?
Just to follow up on that specific topic, I think it's very timely, so I don't want that to linger too long because winter is going to be here before we know it.
All right. Next up, do we need a motion to adjourn into a special session?
Yeah, go on and do it.
Okay, so motion to adjourn into a special session. Anyone? This one's not an executive session. Fight over it. Okay, Vanessa.
She said your name.
Ladies first.
I move that we end our council workshop and convene in a special meeting.
Second, Joel, thank you. All in favor of adjourning the workshop and convening the special council meeting, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. With that, we will move into just one consent agenda item that we were set to talk about last week when we, and Jason, it looks like, is going to give us a presentation.
And thank you, Mayor and Council, for allowing us to get this on your agenda for your consideration today. The resolution before you is very important to the funding of the replacement water treatment package. As I talk about a little bit later in the presentation, the opening deadline for the WIFIA applications are coming up, I believe, on the 6th or 7th of September, and they are processed on a first-come, first-served basis. So we want to make sure that our application is at the front of the queue for that. So I have a very brief presentation. I heard questions the last time this came up in front of you, one of which was to explain the WIFIA loan costs, and as well as a discussion of the current replacement water treatment plant cost estimates. And I have covered both. I did put a number of handouts, one of which is just on WIFIA. It's a great 2 one-pagers that talk about the application process and the overall program. But as a little bit of background, the Water Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, or WIFIA, was created in 2014, and it is a federally run and funded program which is designed to accelerate infrastructure investment in the United States. It does that, excuse me, by providing low-cost loans to credit-worthy agencies with exceptionally flexible payment terms, exceptionally flexible. WIFIA allows agencies to borrow up to 49% of eligible project costs. They allow for up to 35 years of repayment, which is unheard of in the borrowing market. They also allow repayment to be delayed for up to 5 years following substantial completion. That allows agencies who may not have a rate in place to get a rate set in place. We don't have that issue, but that's some of the other really good terms that the WIFIA program offers. However, agencies must be credit worthy, which we are. So one of the questions was, at the time of application, a fee is collected of up to $100,000, potentially more, as it goes through the process. These funds are used by WIFIA to do a credit due diligence, a legal due diligence, and a technical due diligence of the project. They will actually review our design to date, tear into all of the items related to the project, and determine whether or not the project is creditworthy, whether the agency is creditworthy, whether the project is technically capable, and whether or not we have met all of our legal requirements. Any funds that they have not expended during that due diligence period will be applied to the credit processing fees. Now those fees, which will range between $150,000 and $500,000, will actually pay for the cost of the loan. So I wanted to give a couple of comparisons. 2013, our water bonds for construction of Reservoir 3, that was a $4.6 million loan. Issuance cost was $65,000. In 2017 and 18, which is when we issued the bonds for the wastewater treatment plant upgrade, we borrowed $9 million just over and the cost of that was $130,000. In 2018, $7.9 million, and the cost of that was $86,000. What's it going to cost us for the $57 million that we are asking for WIFIA? That is yet to be determined, but it is probably going to be several $100,000. And we did reach out to our bond counsel, and I was hoping that JC was still going to be sitting there to ask her what the issuance of $57 million in debt would cost on the open market, and she gave us a price of about $550,000 on the open market to borrow $57 million. And I did want to note that the application fees that we did list in the council packet are higher, just so that we didn't come in real low and come back with a higher number. So looking at project costs, the council packet lists a project cost of $116,741,000. And these costs do still represent a very high estimate. They include costs that we have already incurred. These are things that we've already paid for, but they are eligible for reimbursement under the WIFIA program. And so we wanted to make sure that those were listed. So in the first column of numbers, let me put my highlighter on here. The first column of numbers right here in the center, these are the numbers that are listed in the WIFIA application. Because at the time of the council packet and the WIFIA application were being filled out, we had not received an updated, what we call, basis of design report. At that time, construction costs were $94 million. Design costs were about 7.2. Our previous land acquisition, and this includes a lot of other previous expenses, are rolled up into here, is $6 million. We were carrying $2 million in contingency, and I just want to note, on a project of this size, $2 million in contingency is not going to get this project built. It will need to be closer to 10% of the project cost. And then $6.6 million in construction management for that total of 116. Since then, we have released the updated basis of design report. Our construction costs have come down to $91 million. Our engineering costs, or our design costs, are down to $5.7 million. We are still carrying $6 million in that land acquisition if we were to do a like-for-like, $2 million contingency, 6.6 construction management, and our overall costs are down at 111. And I continue to see at each meeting, our costs continue to come down as we continue to refine what it is that we're building. I expect to see that really start to come down as we get our 30-60-90 design, which we're presenting to you next Wednesday, the 7th of September. So in February of this year, staff did ask for an increase in the amount of debt offering as costs had dramatically increased. since our original cost estimates were created in 2014. And council gave direction that we were allowed to pursue an additional $20 million in loan funds at the lowest possible interest rates while actively pursuing very large federal grants, such as the FEMA BRIC grant. We've seen costs increase in all sectors at unprecedented rates in the past few years, and in some cases more than doubling the cost of materials and leading to shortages in others. Construction cost estimates that we have today must also predict the conditions when we're actually nearing construction's completion. So we're actually looking at a construction window of 2024 through 2027. So when we're looking at $91 million, that number is anticipating costs in 2025, which is halfway point through the construction window. So as a point of comparison, if we just took our $56 million number that we had created in 2014, and we escalate that by construction indices, and the other two flyers that I provided for you are prepared by Mortenson. Mortenson is a leading design builder in the United States. They're great. They were actually the #2 firm when we selected Sladen and Jacobs, and they generate these cost sheets for their markets and make them available on their website. I did provide Seattle and Portland. The reason I wanted to grab Seattle in addition to Portland, they've only been updating for a few quarters. It's a new indices for them, but Seattle was much more complete. And then the numbers that I actually used for this projection behind me on the screen were the national numbers because they were lower overall. I didn't use the highest indicators, which were the Seattle numbers. But that takes that number all the way up to just under $100 million if we inflate that. So our costs are not that far off from what we had predicted. They just, time has inflated our numbers. So what are we doing to control the cost? Because really that's what it boils down to. We've got to keep these costs down. We've got to fit within our rate. The design build team has implemented a number of measures to control the project costs. Including we do rolling value engineering reviews. So every time we update the basis of design report, we look for items that can be altered to lower the overall cost or provide a higher value. We really want to streamline the project as much as possible, but without affecting the overall life cycle cost. So what we don't want to do is put in a building that has to be rebuilt in 7 years or equipment. We're really looking to get that long 20-year lifespan out of the initial buildings and then longer out of some of the other, actually out of the equipment, longer out of the buildings and structures. We're changing out materials. Looking at steel frame buildings opposed to concrete and masonry because we can get those cheaper and still get a long life cycle cost out of them. We're looking at outdoor electrical gear versus building an electrical building at the old water treatment plant site because we can get gear with a slightly higher cost but not have to build a building and then put the electrical gear in it, thus saving us quite a bit of money. We're looking at the low-cost ponds versus mechanical processes for dewatering solids. We're looking at putting finished water pump under shelters as opposed to putting them inside of a building. We can put up a lower cost shelter instead of a full building, keeping it climate controlled. That does have an end cost somewhere down because those pumps do get exposed to more weather, but they'll be covered from the sunlight, and so it should be pretty minimal. But again, lowering those overall costs, and we do that during every design review. So financing. So it's great that we say that we're controlling all these costs. These costs are still higher than we anticipated. Are we still able to afford this project? And today I believe the answer is yes, but we don't have a final number, so I can't guarantee that. But we're working with numerous agencies to ensure that we can affordably fund this project. And when I say affordably, that means within the rate structure that you have adopted and within its county taking into consideration the 2 reductions of the 5.28% that we incorporated. We're looking at WIFIA, as we talked about. They are very competitive rates, equal to or just slightly higher than Treasury rates. Business Oregon has provided us with multiple loan offerings, some of which are coming forward with significant principal forgiveness. So that means that they will loan us money and then forgive a portion of that principal. Our current water revenues are coming in slightly ahead of where we have anticipated. We are taking another look at that, and then we're putting as many of those dollars as we absolutely can into this project, because the more cash that we can front load the project with, the less borrowing we have to do. And then ARPA, as you know, council directed $3 million of ARPA funds to the project, which have also greatly helped out with our cash balance. And this is updated from the presentation that I sent you last Friday, and I want to point that out. I did not include the construction oversight costs in that initial chart. I totally missed that extra 6.6 million roughly, and that did change the unidentified funding portion from a much lower, I want to say about 2 million to about 9.6, that additional money. So there is still $9.6 million in unidentified funding. Otherwise, we have identified where we believe all of the pieces of funding for this project are coming from, including potential WIFIA if you choose to approve this resolution today, including Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which you also will be considering on the 7th. Water and Wastewater Fund from the state of Oregon. The BIL is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which was passed into law by the Biden administration. The state has indicated that we are likely eligible for over $6 million in that, with over $3 million of that being forgiven. So we really are very close. And then the $9 million in unidentified funding, we believe that that's going to be accounted for in a number of ways. One is we're going to continue to refine the project costs, and the costs are going to continue to come down. And then two, we are going to optimize the amount of water, or the water rates that are being funneled into this program, and both of those together will combine to reduce that number. So costs have increased. We've talked about that. The team is dedicated to ensuring that this project works within the rate structure that has been adopted. We're going to continue to refine those costs as we move forward in time. And then we are working with the rate consultant to reevaluate and ensure that the existing rate does support the needed debt, and that the debt payments will be at or below the current rate schedule. So we did have the current call to action date as today, actually, not 8/17. That was the previous date for that. Because we do want to get that letter of intent in on September 6th so that we are at the front of the queue. And with that, I will take all of your questions.
Thanks, Jason. Questions? Valerie?
Yeah, I just have a little one that you were going over with the unidentified funding, the 9.6 million. You said that refining as we go through, you're going to continue to bring that down. And then you also said water rates, you're having them identified, but that goes back to the fact that you're really working using the rates that we've already established and not raising them more. Is that what you're saying, that we would be able to hopefully do that within that, or clarification?
So two big pieces of that. Yes. Right now, we are working off of what's called a basis of design report. What we have is I think it's a 300-page report that says we are building a membrane treatment plant. We are having this many pumps over here, this many pumps over here. We believe it'll have this type of technology over here. And that's really high level. And it still includes those very, very large margins of error in the contingency. And we believe as we continue each one of those refinements we've done, that cost has gotten a little bit lower. We are now bringing forward on September 7th that resolution to actually start the design of the project, which will come back with 3 levels of design, 30, 60, 90, and then a final design. We believe that during each one of those revisions, those costs will come down as we refine exactly what's being constructed, because then you're putting actual numbers to actual things. Right now, we're still putting imaginary numbers to imaginary things based on experience of the contractor who knows that they cost in general about this much. The other thing is currently we're putting about $3 million per year in our water revenues towards this, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. We're looking at if we can maximize that a little bit more, delaying a couple other capital projects, and increasing the amount of cash that we're able to put in here for the next few years. So that's the other way that we will continue to draw that down. We're also still out looking for additional grants. We will be coming back before you to put back in for BRIC again. We believe we still have a great story. We still haven't heard back on why we weren't selected, but we're going to get back in the queue. Maybe we ask for a little bit less and we change up that application, but we're going to look for other opportunities to find that, to make that gap go away.
Thank you.
Other questions? Joel?
Thank you for the presentation, Jason. So if I understand this correctly, the loan would be for approximately $57 million?
That is correct.
Okay, and then even with that, if I understand your graphics, we would still have a $9 million shortfall?
With all of the funding that we have very clearly identified, what I mean by clearly, that we've either been promised or told that we can get, or funding that we have been told we will get. So there are a few pieces. The BIL funding, we've got $6 million in there. We don't have a piece of paper that says that, but we have an email from the state that says that they believe that that's how much we'll get. That does leave that $9 million. That is also looking at the amount of water rates that we're putting in there. That is the shortfall.
So if I understand what you just told me was we were going to borrow approximately $57 million.
Yep.
It does leave us short about
$9 million.
$9 million, $9.6 million,
Yep.
$9.7 million. And you're looking at options for $6 million of it via a state program?
No, that's counting all of that. That $9 million.
Oh, that's counting all, so this is beyond that.
We will fill that gap with cost reductions through the project and through rate, through the existing rate. We'll either put more money in or we'll find additional grants. We also can apply for congressionally directed spending again, not this year, but next year. That, as you can see, that was a $2 million allocation to the project. So there are other options. We'll be out looking for more funding everywhere, short of a bake sale, but we're considering that as well. So.
Okay, so then if I understand you correctly, then the loan does not cover, or there's still after the loan, a $9.6 million deficit that we project to cover by putting more of our water fees into it without increasing the fees to the homeowner?
Absolutely.
And cost reduction.
Yes. And remember when I said WIFIA, we can only borrow up to 49% of the project cost. And so that number is kind of fixed based on this.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah.
Back on slide 6, there's a breakdown of the project costs, and I thought I heard you say that the contingency needs to be 10% of the project cost, and it's not that right now.
It is not.
So that number needs to be closer to 11.6 instead of 2 million?
Yeah, we'd like to see it between 9 and 11 million to feel comfortable with, and that's the owner's contingency. Now, it can get away with being lower because the contractor is going to be carrying some contingency in that $91 million number also, if that makes sense, because they're going to also carry some contingency knowing that once we start digging and building, we're going to find stuff. What we're likely going to see is the $91 million number comes down, which we fully expect it to do. We're going to move it actually from the 91 million to the 2. Does that make sense? And so the bottom number, that 111, won't change very much. But it will, the money will move from the actual construction to the contingency line where it'll stay, hopefully not to be spent. The other piece is the 6.6 million, which is that construction management. We have not really received a complete breakdown of the construction numbers, and we don't know how much construction management the contractor is holding in that $91 million budget number. So there could be some double counting going there.
Okay. And then I was also curious, the rate structure that was imposed years ago, I'm not sure exactly how that rate structure that was, assuming a cost of $35-ish million less than the cost we're talking about now can sustain funding this project.
Yeah, so it actually was built around borrowing, I want to say $50-some million at 3.5% interest. So the first couple of loans that we're going to be bringing for your consideration are at 1%. So those will greatly help out with that. The other ones are going to be right at Treasury when we actually draw that. So Treasury rates, I don't know where they're floating right now, 3%. So with the lower the interest, you can borrow a little bit more at the same payment reschedule.
Okay. And then when we submit the WIFIA application, down the line, say, 6 months or a year, if for whatever reason we need to significantly change the project scope for whatever reason, is that something to where that can be modified within the existing application, or we would have to reapply?
No, they'll work with you. Once you're in the queue and like significantly change, meaning you're still putting in the same technology, but maybe you're having to scale it way back or phase it a little bit more, WIFIA is really good about working with their clients on that.
Okay, so if we were to decide to, say, not do this project and rehab the existing plan, we would have to redo the WIFIA application?
Yeah, if you went that route, you would have to redo the WIFIA application. That is definitely a different project.
Okay, thank you.
Joel?
If I could, just to follow up on that, you could also apply, be approved, and not ever draw a dime from WIFIA as well, without any penalty, except for what you've already paid.
Joel?
So Jason, I just want to confirm what I thought I heard. Future cost reductions, we're going to cover that $9 million unfunded liability. And then afterwards, in response to Brian's question on the contingency going from 2 million to
about 9 million.
9 million. So that's another $7 million that same cost reduction review is going to, so we're going to have a cost reduction of $16 million. You talked about a reduction in the construction.
And we're going to put more towards of our rates in there as well. Remember, we're going to
Right, so we're not just talking about 9 million unfunded liability, we're talking about 16 million.
No, I don't think it is. I think it's closer to that 9.
9?
We're going to lower the construction cost in addition.
Which is our cost savings.
That's our cost savings. That's going to eat up some of that 9, and then we're going to move that down. It's not a full 16 million, but I'm not quite sure where you're going there, sorry.
Well, I was just confused because the reduction in construction costs was going to cover the 9 million unfunded liability, and then the construction reduction costs were going to cover the increase in contingency. And then the question I had was, well, does the unfunded contingency of $9 million reflected in the $9 million unfunded liability? And it possibly is, knowing how you work. It's just, I'm not sure that it's part of it, or is it in addition to it?
No, I think it's part of it. I guess maybe I'll take a stab at it, Jason.
Yeah.
So you've got the 111 number, say, on the current basis of design. If we reduce and that 111 is going to stay, is what Jason's saying. We're going to try that, and even if the construction cost is reduced, we're still keeping it at 111 because any reduction in construction costs is going to be credited to contingency.
And the 6.6 million in construction management, we believe that number is high.
Right, so then that money won't be available for the unfunded liability of $9 million that we show on slide. The money
I think all of those funds will be available for that altogether, in addition to increasing contingency and lowering the overall unfunded liability.
So then I just want to be clear on this point. So the $9 million in unfunded liability includes the increase of the contingency from 2 to $9 million.
Oh, no, I did not do that.
Okay.
Councilor King, you are correct.
Okay.
And I can generate a memo that incorporates that in with what that plan would be, or I could just talk about it at the presentation on the 7th, because I did not do what you just said.
Well, and then, so that $16 million in unfunded liability, the loan would cover both the increase in the contingency and the unfunded $9 million. Is that correct? let me slow down. So,
Thank you.
the loan that you're asking us to approve today does not cover that $9 million in unfunded liability or the increase in the contingency.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you.
All right, no additional questions. So the way that this is presented is a consent calendar item. So the item, the motion that you would be approving is to authorize the resolution authorizing the city manager to submit the letter of intent and apply for loan funds from the WIFIA program to help finance the water treatment plant project and submit an application if invited and enter into an agreement upon award. And the resolution, the full resolution is on the back of your agenda today. So is there a motion on to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Valerie, all right. Is there a second? Rick?
Is there an opportunity to comment before on consent, or?
Not usually. It's kind of a weird one today, obviously. I don't know, should I allow comment? No. You can vote yes or no. Sorry. I'm not exactly sure why it's listed on consent, but okay. So Valerie, since you made the motion, how do you vote?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Brian?
We've gone up 40% in cost in 9 months. This project, in my opinion, has officially gone sideways, and we haven't even got a shovel in the ground yet. I think we have an excellent public works director, but I am very uncomfortable with the way these numbers are going, and I think that we need to hit the pause button and look at this again, and I'm voting no.
Kurt?
Yes.
All right, motion passes 6-1. And with that, I think our next item is to adjourn the council meeting and the special council meeting and convene in executive session.
Good Lord.
Vanessa?
I move to adjourn a special meeting and enter executive session.
Is there a second? Joel, thank you. All in favor of adjourning and moving into executive session, say aye.
Aye.
Any,
Yes.
any opposed? All right.